Washington, D.C., December 8th, 1941. The city had not slept. The phones in the War Department had not stopped ringing since the previous morning, when the first flash traffic from Hawaii began arriving in broken, urgent bursts. Pearl Harbor, battleships, fire. Somewhere in the building, a junior officer was doing what junior officers do in a crisis, pulling files, cross-referencing reports, trying to find anything that might explain how the most powerful naval base in the Pacific had been gutted in a single morning without warning. He found a document stamped secret, dated October 1924. He opened it, and then he stopped, because on the pages in front of him, written in plain military prose 17 years before the fact, was a description of exactly what had just happened. The author had named the target, the American base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. He had named the method, a surprise air attack launched in the early morning hours. He had named the objectives, the airfields on Ford Island, the fuel storage, the ammunition dumps, the fleet at anchor. He had even named the hour, 7:30 in the morning. The actual attack had begun at 7:55, 25 minutes off, across 17 years. The officer looked at the name on the cover page, Brigadier General William Mitchell, United States Army, the rank he held when he wrote it, the rank they would later take from him for writing it. Then he checked the date of death, listed in the personnel file, February 19th, 1936. The man who had written this document had been dead for 5 years, 10 months, and 19 days. And the United States Army had court-martialed him for writing it. To understand what Billy Mitchell's saw and why no one in power wanted to hear it, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the courtroom, not to Pearl Harbor, back to a boy who had every reason to do nothing and chose to do everything. William Mitchell was born on December 29th, 1879, in Nice, in the south of France. His parents were Americans abroad, the kind of wealthy family that traveled the continent in the Gilded Age, the way other people change rooms. His grandfather, Alexander Mitchell, had been one of the richest men in Wisconsin, a banking and railroad magnate whose name was on buildings before Billy could walk. His father, John Mitchell, sat in the United States Congress, first in the House, then in the Senate. Billy grew up on a large estate near Milwaukee, the eldest of 10 children, surrounded by every comfort a Gilded Age fortune could provide. And from the very beginning, he was restless in a way that money could not fix. In 1898, when the Spanish-American War broke out, Mitchell was a student at Columbian University in Washington, the school the country would later call George Washington University. He was 18 years old. He had a father in Congress who could have arranged a commission with a single telephone call, a family name that opened doors before you knocked. He enlisted as a private soldier, not because he had to, because he could not stand the idea of watching from a distance while something real was happening somewhere else. His father did pull a string, and Billy was commissioned a second lieutenant within weeks. But the instinct, the son of a senator going in at the bottom on his own feet, that instinct tells you everything about the man he was about to become. He could always find a way around the obstacle. He just preferred to go through it first. He served in Cuba. then in the Philippines, then in Alaska, where, as a young officer in 1901 and 1902, he was handed one of the most brutal engineering assignments the Army had to offer, supervising the construction of telegraph lines across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness, terrain that had defeated other men, weather that had stopped other projects cold. Mitchell finished ahead of schedule. He was noticed. He moved through the Army school system. By his early 30s, he was among the youngest officers ever attached to the General Staff in Washington. Before Billy Mitchell was ever a troublemaker, he was a star, a fast-rising officer with a reputation for getting hard things done in places where hard things were supposed to be impossible. That is the part his critics always forgot, or chose to forget. Then he found aviation, and aviation found him. In 1915, he was assigned to the aviation section of the Signal Corps. And here, for the first time, the Army's rules got directly in his way. He was judged too old to enter military flight training. He was 38 years old. Mitchell did what he would keep doing for the rest of his life. He went around the obstacle. He paid for his own civilian flying lessons out of his own pocket in 1916. He took his first solo in a Curtiss JN-4. The trainer the whole country had come to call the Jenny, a canvas and wire machine that smelled of engine oil and possibility. He became friends with Orville Wright. He was not doing this because the Army told him to. He was doing it because he had already decided on his own money and his own time that the airplane was going to change war, and he was going to be the man who understood how before anyone else did. When the United States entered the First World War in the spring of 1917, Mitchell was already in Europe. On April 24th, 1917, while the American Army was still months away from being ready to fight, Billy Mitchell became the first American Army officer to fly over the German lines. He was riding as an observer with a French pilot. His own country had not yet fired a meaningful shot in the war, and Mitchell was already above the enemy, looking down at the trenches, seeing the shape of everything. He set up shop in Paris. He learned everything the British and the French had paid for in blood over 3 years of air war. He formed a close working relationship with the British Air Commander, Hugh Trenchard, a man who shared his conviction that air power was not a tool for the ground army to borrow. It was a weapon in its own right, with its own logic, its own purpose, its own capacity to decide a war on terms that infantry and artillery could never reach. By the late summer of 1918, Mitchell had risen to command the air forces of the American First Army, and in September he was handed a chance that no one had ever been given before. The St. Mihiel Offensive was the first great independent American operation of the war, a drive to cut off a bulge in the German line. Mitchell was given control of the air over the entire battlefield. What he assembled there was unlike anything the world had yet seen. Roughly 1,476 aircraft drawn from 101 American, British, French, and Italian squadrons, concentrated into a single air campaign under a single commander. He divided his force. He planned the waves. He used part of his strength to hammer the German rear while the ground troops advanced below. And the offensive from September 12th to the 16th was a success. Billy Mitchell had just become, in effect, the first air component commander in the history of combined arms warfare. The first man to run a mass air campaign as a coordinated whole, rather than a scattering of individual missions tied to the men in the mud. But here is where the honest history demands precision, because this audience will check the numbers, and because Mitchell himself was not always careful with them. Of that 1,476 aircraft, only about 600 were flown by Americans, and fewer than 50 of those were actually built in America. The rest were French Salmsons and Breguets and Spads, British and Italian machines, flown by Allied crews under Mitchell's operational command. On any given day, perhaps 1,100 to 1,200 of the total were truly mission-capable. That does not diminish what he did. If anything, it sharpens it. He took a patchwork multinational force, equipped largely with aircraft his own country could barely manufacture, and he welded it into a single instrument. And in doing so, he saw something that would obsess him for the rest of his life. He saw what happened when air power was gathered into a mass and aimed with a single purpose, and he understood down to the bone that this was the whole future of the thing. Scatter your aircraft in ones and twos over the trenches, tied to the ground troops as little more than flying scouts, and you wasted them. Concentrate them, send them deep, strike the enemy's supply and command and industry far behind the front, where his armies could not protect them, and you had a weapon that could decide a war on its own terms. A month after Saint Mihiel, in the grinding Meuse-Argonne fighting, Mitchell sent a bombing force of more than 200 aircraft deep behind the German lines. A strike that anticipated the strategic bombing campaigns of the next war by a quarter of a century. He finished the war as a temporary brigadier general, wearing the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Service Medal, the French Croix de Guerre, and the Legion of Honor. And he finished it carrying a theory that the entire American military establishment was about to spend 20 years trying to ignore. The theory was simple, devastating in its implications, and aimed like a rifle at the most powerful institution in the American defense establishment. Air power needed to be its own service, planned and led by airmen, because no admiral married to his battleships and no general married to his infantry would ever use it the way it demanded to be used. That conclusion, drawn from 3 years of watching air power work and fail and work again over the Western Front, pointed straight at a single target. It did not point at Germany. It did not point at Japan. It pointed at the United States Navy and at every admiral who had built his career around the belief that the battleship was the queen of modern war and always would be. Mitchell came home in 1919 and was appointed Assistant Chief of the Air Service. 1 star on his shoulder, a chain of command above him that did not want to hear a word he had to say. His first boss, as Chief of the Air Service, was Major General Charles Menaher, an artilleryman who had never flown an airplane in his life. Sit with that for a moment. The most experienced combat airman in the United States Army reported to a man who had never left the ground, and Mitchell, who had commanded over 1,000 aircraft over the fields of France, was expected to salute and wait his turn. He did not wait his turn. He worked around Menoher. He went to the press. He went to Congress. He made his own commanding officer look like a man standing in the path of history, which was more or less exactly what Menoher was. By 1921, Menoher had had enough. He sent a formal demand to the War Department: fire Mitchell or accept my resignation. The War Department kept Mitchell and replaced Menoher with Mason Patrick. Read that carefully, because it tells you something important about the position Mitchell occupied in the early 1920s, and about why the establishment could never simply be rid of him. He was too useful, too visible, too obviously right about too many things. So instead of removing him, they kept trying to contain him, and the containment kept failing. Patrick was a smarter choice than Menoher. He was not an airman, but he was a pragmatist. He understood that Mitchell was a force that could not be stopped directly, only managed, redirected, absorbed. He would spend the next 4 years trying to do exactly that, with diminishing success. Because Mitchell was not just making noise. He was making arguments, and the arguments were pointed directly at the central question of American defense in the 1920s. What was the next war going to look like? And were the people currently running the American military building for it or building for the last one? Mitchell's answer was unambiguous. The airplane had made the battleship obsolete. A nation that spent its treasure building floating steel fortresses was arming itself for a war that had already been fought and decided. The future belonged to the air, and any commander who did not understand that was not preparing for the next war. He was preparing a disaster. He said this in newspapers. He said it in front of congressional committees. He said it to anyone who would listen, and a fair number of people who would not. He was picking the biggest possible fight with the most powerful institution in the American defense establishment and the Navy. In the spring of 1921, made the mistake that would define the next decade. They agreed to let him prove it. The pressure Mitchell had built in the press forced the issue into the open. In early 1921, the War and Navy departments agreed to a set of joint tests. They would take captured German warships surrendered at the end of the war and sitting idle in American ports, and they would let the Army's bombers try to sink them. The Navy set the rules, and the rules were written to protect the outcome the Navy wanted. The target ships would be anchored well out to sea, roughly 50 miles from the airfield, in water deep enough that a sunken ship could never be salvaged and studied. No aerial torpedoes would be allowed. Only a limited number of the heaviest bombs could be dropped, and inspection parties would be permitted to board the target between attack runs to assess the damage, which had the convenient effect of stretching each attack out over hours and letting the Navy control the pace of the whole exercise. Mitchell accepted the conditions. He had no choice, but he did not accept the outcome they were designed to produce. He formed a new unit for the job, the 1st Provisional Air Brigade, at Langley Field in Virginia. Roughly 125 aircraft and 1,000 men across 6 squadrons. His ordnance officers built a special bomb for the occasion. A monster weighing 2,000 pounds, far larger than anything used in the war. He had his target. He had his weapon. and then a Russian émigré named Alexander de Seversky provided the method that would make the difference. De Seversky, who would later become one of the most famous air power advocates in America, advised Mitchell on a technique the Navy had not anticipated. The best way to sink a great armored ship was not to hit it squarely on the deck, where the armor was thickest. It was to drop the bomb into the water right alongside the hull. The underwater explosion would act like a hammer blow against the ship's unarmored bottom, springing the plates, flooding the compartments, breaking the vessels back from below. The water itself became part of the weapon. Through June and into July of 1921, Mitchell's bombers worked their way up a ladder of targets. First a captured German submarine, the U-117, on June 21st, a small target, but a sinking. Then tests against the old battleship Iowa, fitted out as a radio-controlled target that could steam and maneuver on her own with no crew aboard. The bombers scored hits on a moving ship. The Navy quietly noted that this was more than the air enthusiasts were supposed to be able to do. In mid-July, they sank a German destroyer in about 19 minutes of bombing. Then a light cruiser. Each sinking raised the temperature. Each one ran in the newspapers, and with each one, the admirals watching from the observation ships grew quieter and more anxious because the ships were getting bigger and the main event was still ahead. The main event was the SMS Ostfriesland. She was a Helgoland-class dreadnought commissioned on August 1st, 1911, displacing more than 22,000 tons. A genuine capital ship built in the era when Germany and Britain were racing to out-battleship each other across the North Sea. She had fought at the Battle of Jutland and survived, taking a mine and shrugging it off. The German crews had considered her nearly unsinkable. The Navy's own officers believed she could absorb tremendous punishment. She had watertight compartments, thick belt armor, and the reputation of a ship that simply would not die. On July 20th and 21st, 1921, off the Virginia Capes, Mitchell's bombers went to work on her. On the morning of the 21st, 7 aircraft came in with the 2,000-pound bombs. 6 twin-engine Martin bombers, the type the Army designated the MB-2, also called the NBS-1, and 1 British-designed Handley Page, lumbering out over the Atlantic at a pace you could nearly match on a country road. The first heavy bomb hit the water at 12 minutes past noon. Not the ship, the water just alongside her hull, and the column that rose was not just spray. The underwater shockwave found the unarmored bottom and tore it open. The second bomb. The third. Each column of white water rising and falling alongside the great hull. The sixth heavy bomb struck at 31 minutes past noon. 22 minutes after that first bomb hit the water, the Ostfriesland rolled onto her side and went down by the stern. The unsinkable German dreadnought was gone. Mitchell watched the whole thing from the back seat of his de Havilland, circling above the Virginia Capes. By every account of the men who were there, he was exultant. He had just proven, in front of admirals and generals and the entire American press, that a slow, ungainly biplane carrying a large bomb could send the queen of modern warfare to the bottom of the ocean. The Joint Army-Navy Board met to review the results. They concluded that the battleship remained the backbone of the fleet. They had watched a dreadnought go down in under half an hour, and they wrote down that nothing had changed. The report was signed by General John Pershing himself, the most celebrated soldier in America. Now, it is important to be honest here, because this is exactly where the easy history and the true history part ways. The Navy's objections were not entirely without merit. A stationary ship, unmanned, undefended, no damage control parties fighting the flooding, no anti-aircraft guns firing back, no evasive maneuvers. The admirals argued, with some justice, that real combat conditions would produce a different result, that a battleship underway, fully manned and shooting back, was a fundamentally different target. That objection was not stupid. It was the objection any serious professional would raise. But the establishment did something that went beyond professional skepticism. It used the true small objection to bury the true large conclusion. It took a legitimate technical caveat and turned it into a wall behind which the entire question could be hidden from anyone who might act on it. Mitchell saw exactly what they were doing, and he understood that the fight had just changed in character. He was no longer arguing with men who disagreed with him. He was arguing with men who had decided, for reasons of career and budget and institutional pride, that they could not afford to agree with him, regardless of what the evidence showed. He went back and did it again. In September of 1923, off Cape Hatteras, in the treacherous water the sailors called Diamond Shoals, Mitchell's bombers attacked two obsolete American battleships that had been stricken from the fleet, the former USS Virginia and the former USS New Jersey. On September 5th, 13 bombs of 1,100 pounds each, dropped from 3,000 feet, sent the Virginia to the bottom in roughly half an hour. But the detail that should have stopped the War Department cold was not the sinking, it was the distance. Mitchell's bombers had flown approximately 175 miles from Langley Field to reach those ships, 175 miles over open water. That was the answer to the objection that airplanes were a coastal nuisance, useful only for defending a harbor mouth. Mitchell had just demonstrated that a bomber force could reach well over the horizon, find capital ships in open sea and destroy them. And that reach was only going to grow. The War Department praised the courage of the flyers, filed the results, changed nothing. If you have ever watched an organization gather overwhelming evidence that its favorite idea is wrong, and then carefully explain to itself why the evidence does not count, you already understand the world Billy Mitchell was living in. The pattern is older than any of us. It just does not usually get this many people killed before it resolves itself. Which brings us to the document. In 1923 and into 1924, Mason Patrick made a move that was elegant in its simplicity. He sent Mitchell on a long inspection tour of American and Allied possessions across the Pacific, through Hawaii, the Philippines, Japan, China, and beyond. The official purpose was assessment. The unofficial purpose was to get Mitchell's face out of the Washington newspapers. For a while, to let the temperature drop, to give the admirals and the generals a few months of quiet. Mitchell took the assignment, and he used every hour of it. He traveled with his eyes open in a way that very few American officers of his generation did. He studied the terrain of Hawaii with the eye of a man looking for vulnerabilities, not postcards. He observed the Japanese military with the kind of attention you pay to something you expect to face across a battlefield. He read the strategic logic of the Pacific, the distances, the islands, the choke points, the exposed positions, and he began to see a picture that no one in Washington had assembled. He came home in the autumn of 1924 and wrote it down. The report was dated October 24th, 1924. It ran to approximately 324 pages, though the historian's record on the precise length is not entirely settled. The magazine American Heritage, which published extended excerpts from the original archival document in 1962, described a manuscript of 525 pages that had spent decades buried in the classified files of the War Department. The most likely explanation is that the larger figure covers the entire multi-country assessment, while the smaller covers the section on the Pacific threat specifically. What matters is what the report said. In cold, sober military prose, written 17 years before the fact, Mitchell laid out the coming war. He said that Japan would not open it with a declaration. It would open it with a surprise, and the surprise would fall from the air on a quiet morning against the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. He named the targets with a precision that, in retrospect, is almost unbearable to read. The airfields and hangars on Ford Island, the Navy's fuel oil storage, the ammunition dumps, the water supply, Schofield Barracks, the submarine base, the wharves of Honolulu. He wrote that the attack would be launched with bombardment aircraft striking Ford Island at 7:30 in the morning. The Japanese attack on December 7th, 1941, began at 7:55, 25 minutes off, across 17 years. But here is where the honest account demands something that the popular version almost always skips, because Mitchell's prediction was not the clean prophecy that the legend has made it. He got the concept with an accuracy that is almost supernatural, and he got the mechanism wrong. He did not predict aircraft carriers. In fact, he explicitly discounted them. He did not believe a carrier could put enough aircraft into the air quickly enough to matter. So the attack he imagined was a far more elaborate scheme: submarines carrying disassembled fighter planes in crates, staging through the small westernmost Hawaiian island of Niihau, and through Midway, where the Japanese would construct improvised airstrips, and then strike Oahu with land-based aircraft coming in from the west. The reality was simpler and far more deadly than anything Mitchell had imagined. 6 Japanese fleet carriers steamed to a point north of Hawaii and launched their aircraft in 2 massive waves out of the open ocean. No improvised airstrips, no submarines carrying disassembled planes, just carriers and aircraft, and a plan that was more direct and more devastating than Mitchell's most elaborate forecast. The editors of American Heritage put it precisely when they published his report. He failed to reckon on the development of the aircraft carrier, they wrote, which made many of the details of his plan seem unnecessarily elaborate. even fantastic. And yet his total concept proved alarmingly accurate. That is exactly the right way to hold it. He was wrong about the weapon. He was right about the war, the surprise, the target, and the hour. And the Army's War Plans Division read his report, described the forecast as exaggerated and unsound, and locked it away. By April of 1925, the institutional patience had run out. Mitchell's term as Assistant Chief of the Air Service expired, and with it his temporary rank of Brigadier General. He reverted to his permanent rank Colonel. 2 silver eagles on his shoulders, not the star of a general. He was transferred out of Washington to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, as an aviation officer of the 8th Corps area, far from the newspapers, far from the committee rooms, far from every place where he did his damage. Almost every account of what followed gets his rank wrong. History has kept calling him General Mitchell, out of respect for his war record, and the legend has calcified around that title. But when the events that broke him unfolded, he was a colonel. If you ever see a documentary or a thumbnail showing General Mitchell at his court-martial, that is the legend talking, not the record. The exile to Texas might have quieted a smaller man. It did the opposite to Mitchell, because within months the Navy handed him 2 catastrophes that he could not stay silent about. On September 1st, 1925, a Navy seaplane on a long-distance flight to Hawaii, the PN-9, ran out of fuel and came down in the open Pacific, roughly 450 miles short of the islands. Her crew of 5 survived, drifting for 9 days and eventually sailing the crippled flying boat the final stretch to land, an ordeal that exposed, in front of the entire country, exactly how unready the Navy was for the ocean it claimed to master. 2 days later came the disaster that lit the fuse. The Navy dirigible USS Shenandoah, 680 feet of helium-filled rigid airship, the pride of American naval aviation, had been built to show the flag across the country and demonstrate that American air power was something to be reckoned with. On the night of September 2nd and into the morning of September 3rd, 1925, she was caught in a violent line squall over Ohio and torn apart in the air. She broke into pieces. 14 men died, including her commander, Lieutenant Commander Zachary Lansdowne. Mitchell had known Lansdowne, and he believed with the certainty of a man who had watched the institutional logic of the American military operate for 20 years that the flight had been ordered for public relations purposes, that a fragile airship had been sent into dangerous weather over the Midwest to fly above county fairs and show the flag because the admirals wanted the headlines and were willing to accept the risks that fell on other men. From San Antonio on September 5th, 1925, Colonel William Mitchell issued a written statement to the press. It ran to several thousand words, and in it he said what he had been building toward for 6 years. The recent accidents, he wrote, were the direct result of incompetency, criminal negligence, and almost treasonable administration of the national defense by the Navy and War Departments. He said the bodies of good airmen were moldering under the soil, sent there directly by official stupidity. There was no walking that back. He had accused the senior leadership of the United States Army and Navy in public, in print, of something that bordered on treason. He had done it from a posting in Texas, stripped of his general's star. 6 months after the War Department had tried to silence him by making him small. President Calvin Coolidge read the statement. He was furious. He directed that charges be brought, and the Army obliged. Mitchell was charged under the 96th Article of War, the catch-all provision covering conduct that brings discredit upon the military service on 8 separate specifications drawn from his statement. The machinery of a court-martial ground into motion. Douglas Waller, in his book A Question of Loyalty, which remains the definitive account of what followed, makes the case that Mitchell provoked the court-martial deliberately, that he understood what his statement would produce and chose to produce it anyway, that he wanted the biggest possible stage for his argument, and a court-martial in Washington would give him an audience that no newspaper interview and no congressional hearing ever could. If that is true, and the evidence suggests it largely is, then it was the boldest and most self-destructive bet of his life. The court-martial convened on October 28, 1925, in a converted warehouse at the foot of Capitol Hill. Not a grand hall, not a chamber worthy of the man's record or the question at stake. A plain brick building with poor light and hard chairs, as if the point were to make the whole proceeding feel small and temporary and beneath serious notice. It did not feel small. For 7 weeks, it was the biggest show in Washington. The court was composed of 12 senior generals, men whose careers had been made in the ground army, men who had risen through the infantry and the artillery and the cavalry, men for whom the airplane was a tool and the battleship was the natural order of things. They would sit in judgment on the man who had spent 6 years telling the country that their entire way of war was obsolete. Among them was Douglas MacArthur, an old acquaintance of Mitchell's from earlier army days, one of the youngest generals on the court. He later wrote that the assignment was one of the most distasteful orders he ever received. He wrote that he did what he could on Mitchell's behalf. It has been widely believed ever since that MacArthur was one of the votes to acquit, though, because the ballot was secret, it has never been officially confirmed. Treat that as likely but unproven. The way you should treat any comfortable story a famous man tells about his own conduct. After the fact, when the outcome is already known and the cost of conscience has already been paid by someone else. The prosecution was led by a sharp, aggressive lawyer, Major Allen Gullion. His strategy was clear from the opening days. Keep the case narrow, drag it down from the grand question of national defense to the specific words on the page. The 96th article did not ask whether Mitchell's warnings were accurate. It asked whether his statement brought discredit upon the military service. And on that narrow L question, the answer was not difficult to reach. Mitchell had called the leadership of the Army and Navy criminals. He had used the word treasonable in public print. Those words, in that context, by an officer in uniform, that was the charge. Not whether he was right about Pearl Harbor. Not whether the battleship tests had proven what he said they proved. Whether he had said those words, he had, and he knew it. The defense was led by Congressman Frank Reed, and the witness list read like a roll call of American aviation history. Eddie Rickenbacker, the top American ace of the First World War, a man the public knew and trusted, took the stand. The New York Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia, who had served as an airman himself during the war, delivered a line that cut through the whole proceeding. He said that Mitchell was not being judged by his peers, but by the dog robbers of the general's staff, meaning the general's own men, serving their general's interests. The remark captured what everyone in Mitchell's corner already felt, and it ran in every newspaper the next morning. And then there were the two young majors, Henry Arnold, whom everyone called Hap, and Carl Spaatz. They were relatively junior officers in 1,925 men in the middle years of careers that had not yet revealed their destination. They took the stand and testified for Mitchell, and when their testimony was done, they sat in that warehouse courtroom and watched the army dismantle the man who had argued for everything they believed in. Think about what they were learning. The men who would one day command the greatest air force the world had ever built, who would put 1,000 bombers over Germany in a single raid, who would carry the war to Japan from the Marianas and reduce the industrial heart of the empire to ash. Those men were sitting in a converted warehouse, watching their profit get destroyed by the institution they both still served. They were learning the lesson that Mitchell had refused to learn. You fought the establishment quietly, from the inside, through channels and patience and the slow accumulation of rank and influence. Or you did not survive to fight at all. The trial had its moments of genuine drama. The widow of Commander Lansdowne, Margaret Lansdowne, took the stand and delivered testimony that cracked the courtroom open. She told the court that the Navy had attempted to influence her testimony, that she had been pressured to sign a statement indicating that her husband had willingly accepted the flight into dangerous weather, that he had raised no objections, that the decision had been his as much as anyone's. If true, and she said it was true, this was not a procedural embarrassment. This was confirmation from a witness with no conceivable motive that the institution Mitchell had accused Egret of criminal negligence was engaged in the active suppression of evidence in its own defense. For a brief moment, the trial threatened to become exactly the referendum on air power and institutional accountability that Mitchell had been trying to force for 6 years. Goulian moved quickly. He pulled the focus back to the narrow question, the legal question, the only question the court was empowered to answer. Colonel Mitchell, did you say these words? Yes or no? And that narrowing was fatal, because on the narrow question, there was almost nothing to argue. He had said the words. The words brought discredit on the service by the plain meaning of the article. Whether the words were true, whether the Shenandoah had been sent to its death for a publicity stunt, whether the battleship admirals were building monuments to a dead era, whether a Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor was coming and the American military was doing nothing to stop it. None of that was before the court. Only the words. On December 17th, 1925, after deliberating for approximately 3 hours, the court found Colonel William Mitchell guilty on the charge and every specification. The vote was by secret ballot. It did not need to be unanimous. It was not. The sentence was severe: suspension from rank, command, and duty, with forfeiture of all pay and allowances for 5 years. The court added a note that it had been lenient in light of his distinguished service in the war. They had convicted the most decorated air commander in the country, and they called 5 years without rank or pay the merciful option. President Coolidge reviewed the sentence and softened it slightly. Not enough to mean anything, enough to say he had. Rather than stripping Mitchell of all income, he directed that Mitchell receive half his monthly pay along with his allowances. As the Air and Space Forces magazine account of the case records, that came to $397, $67 a month. Mitchell received his copy of the president's decision at 15 minutes past 6 in the evening on January 25th, 1926. The following day, he made his choice. He would not serve out a sentence as a broken and silenced man drawing half pay. He submitted his resignation from the United States Army, effective February 1st, 1926, 28 years after he had enlisted as a private soldier. The finest combat airman the country had produced walked out of the service for the last time, a convicted man on his own terms. Still certain he was right, he did not go silent. That is the first thing to understand about the decade that followed. The easy version of the story ends with the resignation, the broken man walking out of the building, the system victorious, the argument over. But Mitchell was not built for silence, and the argument was not over. It had simply moved to a smaller room. He retired to a farm in Middleburg, Virginia, in the horse country west of Washington, a quiet place, far from the committee rooms and the press galleries where he had done his damage. And from that farm, he kept writing. He had already published Winged Defense in 1925, before the court-martial, laying out the case for air power and an independent air force in plain language for the general reader. In 1930, he published Skyways, continuing the argument in the same steady, certain voice. He lectured to anyone who would listen. He gave interviews to newspapers that now ran him on the inside pages, if they ran him at all. He testified before congressional committees that received him politely and acted on nothing, he said. He kept warning about Japan. He kept insisting that the Pacific was where the danger lay, that air power would decide the next war, that the country was building the wrong forces for the wrong enemy in the wrong way. He said it in print and in person and in letters to former colleagues who had stayed inside the system and risen to positions where they might have acted on what he told them. And the country which had convicted him and moved on was not listening. There is a particular loneliness in being right slowly, in watching the clock move toward a catastrophe you have described in detail, while the people with the power to prevent it explain patiently and with great institutional confidence why your description is exaggerated. Mitchell lived inside that loneliness for 10 years. Not the dramatic loneliness of a man in a cell, but the quiet, grinding loneliness of a man shouting a warning into a wind that carries the sound away before it reaches anyone. The newspapers that had once splashed his every statement across the front page now ran brief items about his books and his speeches, tucked between the commodity prices and the society notices. The admirals and the generals who had sat in judgment on him continued to build the fleet they believed in: more battleships, more cruisers, the great armored line that would hold the Pacific against any enemy. He watched all of it from Middleburg, and he kept writing. His health began to fail in his early 50s. The years of combat flying, of open cockpits in the cold air over France and the Atlantic, of pushing himself through a schedule that would have broken younger men, had taken a toll that money and stubbornness could not entirely repair. He developed heart trouble. He was susceptible to illness in a way he had never been during the years when the fight was still in front of him. On February 19th, 1936, William Mitchell died at a hospital in New York City. He was 56 years old. The cause was heart disease, complicated by influenza. He died a private citizen with a criminal conviction on his record on a February afternoon, largely forgotten by the institution he had given his life to. The newspapers ran obituaries that were respectful, even admiring, in the way that obituaries for inconvenient men often become generous once the inconvenience is safely past. They noted his war record. They noted the court-martial. They noted, with varying degrees of candor, that he had spent his last years warning about dangers the country had chosen not to take seriously. He did not live to hear the word vindication. He did not live to see the B-25 carry his name over Tokyo. He did not live to see the 1,000 bomber raids over Germany, or the Independent Air Force, or the gold medal. He did not live to hear the sound of Japanese aircraft over Ford Island on a Sunday morning in December and understand, in the same moment of horror that gripped every American who heard the news, that the catastrophe he had described in a classified report 17 years earlier had arrived and taken thousands of Americans with it. He died believing the establishment had won. In the short run, it had. December 7th, 1941. The attack came out of the north, which was not precisely the direction Mitchell had predicted, but close enough that the difference was a technical footnote against the weight of everything else he had gotten right. 6 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, had steamed to a position approximately 230 miles north of Oahu and launched their aircraft in 2 waves. 353 planes in total, rising before dawn over the cold Pacific and turning south toward a harbor full of ships that no one had thought to protect. The first wave struck at 7:55 in the morning. Ford Island, the airfields, the ammunition dumps, the fleet at anchor along Battleship Row, moored in the neat, orderly line that made them easier to service in peacetime and easier to kill in war. The USS Arizona took a bomb into her forward magazine and vanished in a fireball that men miles away could see rising over the island. She went down rapidly, taking 1,177 of her crew with her. The USS Oklahoma capsized at her moorings, trapping hundreds of men in the darkness below the waterline. The USS West Virginia, the USS California, the USS Nevada battered, burning, settling into the harbor mud. By the time the last Japanese aircraft turned back toward the carriers, the United States Pacific Fleet had been gutted at its moorings. 2,403 Americans were dead. 1,178 more were wounded. The battle fleet that the establishment had spent 20 years calling the backbone of American power lay broken in the mud of Pearl Harbor. The thing that the Army-Navy football program had said could not happen had just happened to an entire fleet on a Sunday morning. And 3 days later, the last argument was settled. On December 10th, 1941, off the eastern coast of Malaya, a Japanese force of land-based bombers and torpedo planes found the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse steaming at sea, not moored in a harbor, not unmanned and undefended, underway, maneuvering, fully crewed, throwing up anti-aircraft fire with everything they had. The Prince of Wales was one of the most modern battleships in the world. She had carried Winston Churchill across the Atlantic to meet Franklin Roosevelt at the Atlantic Charter Conference just 4 months earlier. She was the pride of the Royal Navy in the Pacific, the kind of ship that admirals on both sides of every ocean had spent their careers arguing was the decisive instrument of naval power. The aircraft sank her in under 2 hours. They sank off the Repulse alongside her. More than 840 men went into the South China Sea. This was the exact scenario that the American naval establishment had insisted would come out differently. Not a helpless anchored target, not a ship with no crew and no guns. Capital ships fighting back at sea against aircraft. And it came out precisely the way Mitchell had said it would, in testimony and reports and demonstrations that the institution had spent 20 years explaining away. In a single week of December 1941, the entire argument was closed. Pearl Harbor was the vindication of the harbor prophecy. The loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse was the vindication of the battleship tests the direct answer to every admiral who had insisted that a manned, maneuvering warship fighting back would survive where the Ostfriesland had not. Between them, in 7 days, history settled every question the establishment had used to bury him. The cost of that settlement was measured in the lives of sailors who deserved better from the men above them. Back in Washington, men who had sat in that inverted warehouse in December of 1925 and voted to destroy Billy Mitchell were now running a war that looked exactly like the war he had described. The admirals who had signed the reports concluding that the battleship remained the backbone of the fleet were now watching their battleships burn. The generals who had transferred him to Texas and stripped him of his star were now trying to build, in months, the air force he had spent his career demanding. They built it, that has to be said clearly. The men who followed Mitchell's path without Mitchell's willingness to be destroyed by it, Arnold and Sparks, and the generation that learned from watching him fall, they built something extraordinary. The United States Army Air Forces that fought from 1942 to 1945 was the vindication of everything Mitchell had theorized over the fields of France in 1918. The strategic bombing campaigns over Germany and Japan, the close air support that helped break German resistance in Normandy, the B-29s over the Japanese home islands, all of it traced back in a direct and documented line, to the ideas of a man the army had convicted as a criminal 20 years before. In April of 1942, 16 twin-engine bombers lifted off the deck of an aircraft carrier and struck Tokyo in the first American blow against the Japanese home islands. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led the raid. The bombers were called the B-25, the B-25 Mitchell. To this day, it remains the only American military aircraft ever named for a specific individual. Not a place, not a concept, not a number, a person. The men who flew the first bombs onto Japan flew them in a machine that carried the name of the man who had died 6 years earlier, convicted and largely forgotten, still insisting on a truth that the institution had decided not to hear. Think about that for a moment. The formal honors came slowly, the way institutional acknowledgements always do, wrapped in ceremony and drained of urgency by the passage of time. In 1946, Congress authorized as a special one-of-a-kind gold medal in recognition of Mitchell's pioneering service and foresight in military aviation, a unique medal, separate from all existing honors, created specifically for him. In 1948, that medal was presented to his son by General Karl Spaatz, the same Karl Spaatz who had testified for Mitchell as a major in that warehouse courtroom in 1925, who had watched the army destroy his prophet and learned, in the watching, how to survive inside the institution long enough to change it, who was now, in 1948, the first Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, the independent air service that Mitchell had demanded and been convicted for demanding and died without seeing. Spaatz placed the medal in the hands of Mitchell's son and said nothing that history has chosen to record at length. There was no formal apology. The conviction was never overturned. A review board in the late 1950s concluded that Mitchell had, in effect, been tried for his views rather than for any genuine offense against military order, and recommended that the record be addressed. The recommendation did not resolve cleanly. The paperwork moved through the system in various forms over the following years, and never arrived at a definitive end. The conviction stands to this day. There was no moment of official reckoning, no ceremony in which the institution looked at what it had done and said plainly that it had been wrong, and that the cost of being wrong had been measured in the lives of men who deserved better. The gold medal was not that. The B-25 was not that. The creation of the Air Force was not that. They were the vindication of the idea. They were not the acknowledgement of the crime. So what do we make of it, finally? What was the failure, and whose was it? The criticism of Mitchell is real, and it deserves to be stated without softening. He was often his own worst enemy. He overstated his numbers when the accurate numbers would have served him better. He claimed more for the battleship tests than the controlled conditions could honestly support, and in doing so, he handed the Navy an easy way to dismiss the whole enterprise. He was vain. He was insubordinate, as a matter of temperament as much as principle. There were moments when it is hard to escape the sense that he loved the fight for its own sake, and would have found a way to pick it even in a service that agreed with everything he believed. Alfred Hurley, whose biography, Billy Mitchell, Crusader for Air Power, remains the standard scholarly account, does not flinch from any of this. Mitchell was a crusader, and crusaders are exhausting to be around, and frequently wrong about the details, even when they are right about the cause. But now, the other side of the ledger, and it is not a close calculation. On the questions that actually determined the shape of the next war, Billy Mitchell was right, and the entire weight of the American military establishment was wrong. He was right that aircraft could sink capital ships. He proved it twice, and was told twice that he had proven nothing. He was right that a surprise air attack would open the Pacific War. He named the harbor 17 years in advance and was told his forecast was exaggerated and unsound. He was right that air power required its own service, its own leadership, its own doctrine, and the United States Air Force, created in 1947, is the permanent monument to that argument. Douglas Waller's central conclusion in A Question of Loyalty is the one that stays with you. Mitchell was not really tried for the words in his statement. He was tried for his views. The 96th Article of War was the instrument. But the offense, the thing the establishment could not tolerate, was that he kept telling the country a truth that the institution had decided it could not afford to hear. That is a pattern older than any army. An institution builds itself around a comfortable idea. It staffs its senior ranks with the people who rose by believing that idea. And then it treats anyone who attacks the idea not as a colleague raising a difficult question, but as a threat to be contained, managed, reduced, and if necessary, destroyed. The evidence accumulates. The great warship sinks. The report names the harbor and the hour, and the institution locks it away, promotes the men who kept quiet, and waits for time to make the inconvenient man small enough to ignore. Mitchell's real failure, if you want to call it, that was that he would not manage upward. He would not soften the argument. He would not wait his turn. He would not play the long inside game the way Arnold and Spatz did, the game that required swallowing your certainty on Monday so that you could still be in the room to act on it on Friday. And so the men who played the inside game inherited the future he had described. They built the force he had envisioned. They won the war he had predicted, and they did it in airplanes that carried his name. While his conviction remained on the record and his apology remained undelivered. Here is the thought that stays with you long after the details fade. Billy Mitchell died on February 19th, 1936, believing the establishment had won. He had been out of the army for 10 years. His warnings had been filed away. His reputation had been managed down to a size the institution found comfortable. He died without hearing the sound of aircraft over Ford Island, without seeing the Arizona vanish in a column of fire, without knowing that the harbor he had named in a classified document in 1924 had become the most consequential address in American military history. He died thinking he had lost, and in every way that can be measured in a man's lifetime, in rank, in pay, in reputation, in the comfort of being believed by the people with the power to act, he had lost. But there is another kind of winning, slower and colder and more permanent. The kind that does not arrive in your lifetime. The kind that history delivers, without ceremony, without apology, without any of the warmth that vindication is supposed to carry. The kind where the record simply shows, for anyone willing to read it, that one man saw clearly and said so, and that the people who silenced him paid for their silence with other men's lives. That is the kind of winning that belonged to Billy Mitchell. Every pilot who has ever lifted off from an American airfield and climbed toward a combat mission has done so in the world that Mitchell saw first, the independent Air Force he demanded and was convicted for demanding, the doctrine he developed and was ridiculed for developing, the understanding of air power as a decisive arm in its own right, not a servant of the infantry or an appendage of the fleet, but a weapon with its own logic and its own capacity to determine the outcome of a war. He paid for that world with everything he had: his rank, his pay, his reputation, his career, and the last 10 years of his life spent on a farm in Virginia, writing warnings into a silence that the institution had decided was permanent. It was not permanent. The silence ended on the morning of December 7th, 1941, over a harbor in Hawaii, in the sound of aircraft engines and the thunder of bombs finding the ships that the program had said could not be sunk. Billy Mitchell had been dead for 5 years, 10 months, and 18 days. He had been right all along, and nobody who mattered ever said they were sorry.